Make him stop, or I'm calling my lawyer." The man's voice cut through the cabin like a blade, sharp enough to silence conversations row by row until all that remained was the sound of a child unraveling at 30,000 feet, a high, desperate cry that didn't fade, didn't pause, just kept rising and falling like a storm trapped inside a small body. And Lucas Whitmore was at the center of it, curled halfway into his seat, fingers gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, his breathing uneven, eyes unfocused as if the world around him had become too loud, too bright, too much, and the overhead lights hummed softly, the kind of low electric buzz most people never noticed, but right now it seemed to echo through every inch of the cabin, amplifying everything, tightening the air, making each second stretch longer than it should, while a flight attendant knelt beside him with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, speaking in gentle tones that dissolved before they could land. And across the aisle, Daniel Whitmore sat rigid, his tailored jacket pulled tight across his shoulders, one hand gripping his phone as a specialist's face flickered across the screen, voice calm, clinical, offering instructions that felt hollow in the moment. Try grounding techniques, maintain structure. But structure had already collapsed, and Daniel's jaw tightened as he glanced around at the other passengers, their patience thinning, their whispers growing sharper. Someone muttering about delays, another sighing loudly, the tension building like pressure behind glass. And then a woman in the second row leaned toward the aisle, her voice low but cutting. "Some people shouldn't fly if they can't control their kids." And Daniel's head snapped toward her, anger flashing for a split second before it was swallowed by something heavier, something closer to helplessness, because control was the one thing he'd always had, the one thing that built everything around him. And now it slipped through his fingers, like water. And in the back of the plane, near the last row where the seats felt narrower and the air colder, Nia Carter sat still, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands. Her eyes fixed not on the crowd, not on the tension, but on the boy, on the rhythm of his breath, on the way his shoulders rose too fast, fell too hard, a pattern she recognized without needing to think, because she had seen it before, felt it before, lived it in quiet rooms where no one else knew what to do. And the memory pressed against her chest, steady and insistent, until sitting still became impossible, and slowly, without announcement, she unbuckled her seatbelt, the click barely audible under the noise. But the movement drew eyes anyway, a few heads turning, brows furrowing, someone whispering, "Where does she think she's going?" But Nia didn't look at them, didn't answer. She just stepped into the aisle, her movements measured, careful, as if she were walking into something fragile, something that could shatter with the wrong step. And as she moved forward, the cabin seemed to tighten again, attention shifting, following her, until she reached the row where the noise lived, where Lucas's cries still echoed, and she stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too far, just enough to be present. And Daniel looked up, his expression hard, defensive, the reflex of someone used to being in charge. "We've got this handled," he said quickly, his voice clipped, controlled. But Nia's gaze didn't waver, calm, steady, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, almost soft enough to be lost in the air. "He's not out of control," she said, her words landing differently than anything else that had been said so far. Not sharp, not urgent, just certain. "He's overwhelmed." And for a brief second something shifted, not in the boy, not yet, but in the space between everyone watching, a pause that hadn't existed before, and Daniel frowned, confusion flickering beneath irritation, as if he'd heard something he didn't understand but couldn't ignore, and behind him someone scoffed under their breath, the tension threatening to snap again. But Nia didn't react, didn't rush. She simply lowered herself slowly to the floor, right there in the aisle, ignoring the looks, the whispers, the rules she was probably breaking. And the moment her knees touched the carpeted floor, something about the scene changed, like the storm had found a center, and the plane, still moving through miles of open sky, seemed to hold its breath. Daniel did not sit down, not yet, his body still tense as if every instinct told him to pull his son away from this stranger, to restore order, to reassert control over a situation that had slipped too far beyond his reach. But Lucas did not notice him anymore, not in the way he had seconds ago, because something in the rhythm had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The sharp edges of his cries softening into uneven breaths that came slower now, less frantic, as if they were searching for something to hold on to. And on the floor Nia remained still, her back straight but relaxed, her hands resting loosely on her knees, palms open, not reaching, not forcing, just present. And she inhaled again, long and steady, then exhaled just as slowly, her shoulders rising and falling in a quiet pattern that did not demand attention but invited it. And Lucas's eyes flickered toward her, not fully focused, but drawn, the way someone lost might notice a distant light without understanding why. And for a moment his hands paused, hovering in the air, unsure, before dropping slightly as his breathing stuttered, trying to match something it could not yet fully follow. And the flight attendant who had been kneeling beside him slowly leaned back, her expression shifting from urgency to cautious observation, as if she understood that stepping in now might break something fragile that had just begun to form. And a man across the aisle lowered his phone, the complaint he had been typing forgotten mid-sentence, while the woman who had spoken earlier pressed her lips together, her posture stiff but silent, because the noise that had filled the cabin moments ago was no longer constant. It was breaking apart, and that change, however small, demanded attention. And Daniel noticed it too, his grip on the phone loosening as the voice of the specialist continued to speak in the background. Words about protocols and strategies fading into something distant and irrelevant, because none of those instructions had done this. None of them had reached his son in this way. And he looked at Nia again, really looked this time, at the way she did not rush, did not react to the stares or the tension or even to him, as if none of that mattered compared to the small, trembling boy in front of her. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, slow enough that each word seemed to land gently in the space between breaths. "It is okay," she said, not to Daniel, not to anyone else, only to Lucas. "You do not have to fight it." And Lucas's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of his seat, his chest rising unevenly before falling again, less sharply now. And then something happened that no one in that cabin had expected. Not the passengers, not the flight attendant, not even Daniel. Lucas leaned forward, just a few inches, but enough to close the distance, enough that his gaze settled more clearly on Nia's face. And in that moment his voice broke through the quiet, small and fragile and unmistakably different from before. "Too loud," he murmured, the words barely formed but real, clear enough that Daniel's breath caught in his throat, because he had not heard his son say anything since they boarded the plane. Not one coherent word, not through all the attempts, all the sessions, all the structured routines that were supposed to help. And now here, in the middle of a crowded cabin, with a stranger sitting on the floor, his son had spoken. And the realization hit him with a force that had nothing to do with noise or chaos. Something deeper, something that unsettled everything he thought he understood. And Nia nodded slowly, as if the words made perfect sense, as if they were exactly what she had been waiting for. "I know," she said softly, matching her breath to his again, steady, patient. "We can make it quieter together." And for the first time since the plane left the ground, Lucas did not scream, he just breathed, uneven but trying. And the entire cabin, every person watching, seemed to lean into that fragile silence, afraid to disturb it, because something important was happening, something none of them could fully explain. And Daniel, still standing, finally lowered himself into his seat, not because he had regained control, but because he understood, even if only slightly, that this moment did not belong to him anymore. The quiet did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like warmth returning to cold hands, fragile and uncertain. And Lucas was still trembling, his breath uneven, but no longer breaking into sharp cries, his small body leaning slightly forward as if the space between him and Nia had become the only place that felt steady. And Nia did not move closer. She did not reach for him. She only adjusted her breathing again, deeper this time, slower, letting each inhale stretch long enough to be noticed, then releasing it gently. And Lucas followed, not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough that the tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. And that fraction was everything. And behind him Daniel watched in silence, his mind racing in a way that had nothing to do with business or numbers or control, because none of those rules applied here. None of the systems he trusted had prepared him for this. And he glanced at his phone, the specialist still speaking, still offering guidance that now felt disconnected from what was unfolding right in front of him. And without saying anything, he lowered the volume until the voice disappeared completely, because he needed to hear this, needed to understand it. And the cabin seemed to respond in kind. Conversations had stopped, phones lowered. Even the low hum of movement felt distant, as if every person on board had become part of the same suspended moment. And Nia spoke again, her tone soft but grounded. "Can you hear the engines?" she asked, not expecting a full answer, just planting something steady, something predictable. And Lucas's eyes shifted slightly, not toward her face this time, but upward, as if he were listening in a new way. And the sound had always been there, constant, low, but now it became something else, something he could anchor to, and his breathing matched it. Uneven at first, then closer again, and Nia nodded gently, as if confirming a step only she could see. "They do not change," she continued quietly. "They stay the same, no matter what." And Lucas's fingers, which had been curled tight, began to loosen, one by one, until they rested against the armrest without tension, and that small release sent a visible ripple through the cabin, a shift in posture, a shared exhale that no one realized they had been holding. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried before. "Lucas," he said carefully, testing the space. But Lucas did not respond to him. Not yet, his focus still fixed on the rhythm Nia had created. And for a moment Daniel looked like he might speak again, might try to step in. But something stopped him, something new, something unfamiliar, the understanding that interrupting now could break the only progress they had made. And that realization settled heavily in his chest, not as frustration, but as humility. And across the aisle the flight attendant exchanged a glance with another crew member, both of them choosing to remain still, to protect the fragile calm that had replaced the chaos. And Nia shifted just slightly, enough to keep her presence steady but not overwhelming. "You are doing it," she whispered, almost more to reinforce the moment than to instruct. And Lucas's breathing steadied further, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that no longer fought against itself. And then, slowly, he leaned back into his seat, not collapsing, not retreating, just settling, as if his body had finally found a place where it could rest. And the silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but full, like a room that had just been filled with something invisible yet undeniable. And Daniel sat back as well, his shoulders lowering for the first time since the flight began, his eyes still fixed on Nia. But now there was no resistance in them, no dismissal, only a quiet realization forming, something he was not ready to say out loud yet, but something that had already begun to change the way he saw the moment. The boy and the girl sitting calmly on the floor as if none of this had ever been extraordinary. The silence held, but it was no longer fragile in the same way. It had weight now, a presence that filled the cabin from front to back. And Lucas sat there with his head resting lightly against the seat, his breathing slow enough to match the steady hum of the engines, his fingers no longer clenched but relaxed against his lap. And Nia remained where she was on the floor, not rushing to stand, not breaking the rhythm that had taken so much to build, her gaze soft, attentive, as if she were listening to something deeper than sound. And for a few seconds nothing changed, no one moved, not even the flight attendants, because everyone understood without being told that this moment mattered, that interrupting it could undo everything. And Daniel felt that too, more clearly than anything he had felt since the flight began, his hands resting still for the first time, his shoulders no longer locked in tension. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of authority, almost careful. "What did you do?" he asked, not demanding, not accusing, but genuinely uncertain. And Nia did not look at him right away. She kept her attention on Lucas for another breath, another slow inhale and exhale, making sure the rhythm held before answering. And when she did, her voice was simple, steady. "I did not do anything to him," she said. "I stayed with him." And the words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had been said before, because they did not come with instructions or explanations, just truth. And Daniel frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion, as if he were trying to understand something that did not fit into the way he had always approached problems. And he glanced at his son again, at the calm that had replaced the chaos. And something inside him shifted, something uncomfortable, because it suggested that everything he had been trying to do had been wrong, or at least incomplete. And he leaned forward, his voice dropping even further. "He is specialists," he said, almost defensively. "We have been working on this for years." And Nia nodded once, not dismissing it, not challenging it, just acknowledging it. "I am sure you have," she replied softly, and then after a small pause she added, "But sometimes he does not need someone to fix it. Sometimes he needs someone who understands what it feels like." And Daniel's expression tightened again, not with anger, but with something closer to realization, something that made him look away for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands as if he were seeing them differently. And across the aisle a man shifted in his seat, exhaling quietly, the tension that had filled the cabin earlier now replaced by a kind of shared awareness, as if everyone present had witnessed something they could not quite explain but would not forget. And Lucas shifted slightly in his seat, not agitated, just adjusting, and his eyes moved toward Nia again, more focused now, more aware, and he spoke once more, his voice still soft but clearer than before. "It is quieter now," he said, and Nia smiled gently, the first visible change in her expression since she had sat down. "Yes," she said. "You made it quieter," and Lucas blinked slowly, as if processing that idea, as if recognizing for the first time that he had some control over the overwhelming world around him. And Daniel looked at him, really looked this time, not as a problem to solve or a situation to manage, but as a child trying to make sense of something too big. And that shift in perspective settled deep in his chest, heavier than any pressure he had felt earlier. And after a moment he spoke again, this time to Nia, his voice steady but different. "Can you stay?" he said, not as a command, not as a transaction, but as a request, simple and sincere. And for a brief second the question hung in the air, not just between them, but across the entire cabin, because everyone understood what it meant, not just for the rest of the flight, but for something beyond it, something that had only just begun. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, simple words carrying a weight that shifted the entire moment. And Nia did not answer right away, not because she was unsure, but because she was still listening, still watching Lucas's breathing, making sure the calm held, making sure it was not just a pause before another wave. And Lucas remained steady, his chest rising and falling in that quiet rhythm, his eyes half focused but no longer lost. And only then did Nia lift her gaze slightly toward Daniel, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. And she nodded once, small and unassuming. "I can stay," she said, her voice calm, as if the request itself had not surprised her, as if she had already decided the moment she sat down that she would not leave until the storm had truly passed. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that felt heavier than it should have been, as if it carried something more than relief, something closer to surrender. And he leaned back into his seat, not as a man regaining control, but as someone learning to let go of it, at least for now. And the cabin seemed to soften around them, the tension that had once been sharp now replaced by a quiet attentiveness, a collective awareness that something rare had unfolded. And a flight attendant stepped forward carefully, her movements slower than before, placing a small bottle of water on the armrest near Lucas without speaking, without breaking the calm. And Nia gave a slight nod of thanks without shifting her position, and Lucas's fingers moved again, not in distress this time, but reaching, hesitant at first, then more certain as he picked up the bottle, his movements slower than usual but controlled, and he held it in both hands, grounding himself in something tangible, something real. And Nia watched closely, not interfering, just present, ready if needed. And after a moment she spoke again, her tone soft but guiding. "Try a sip," she said, gently, and Lucas lifted the bottle, his hands still trembling slightly. But he managed, taking a small drink before lowering it again, and the simple act seemed to anchor him further, his breathing evening out even more. And Daniel watched all of it with a focus that bordered on disbelief, his eyes moving between his son and the girl on the floor, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew. And he leaned forward again, this time slower, more cautious. "What is your name?" he asked, not out of formality, but because it suddenly felt important, and Nia answered without hesitation. "Nia," she said, and then after a brief pause she added, "Nia Carter," and Daniel repeated it quietly under his breath, as if committing it to memory, as if understanding that this moment would not be something he could simply move past once the plane landed. And Lucas shifted again, turning his head slightly toward his father, his expression still fragile but clearer than before, and for a second it seemed like he might speak again. But instead he just looked, really looked, and Daniel held that gaze, his own expression softening in a way it had not earlier, the sharp edges replaced by something more open, more present. And Nia noticed the exchange but did not interrupt it, did not guide it, because this part did not belong to her. And the engines continued their steady hum, unchanged, constant, a quiet backdrop that now felt less overwhelming and more like a rhythm that held everything together. And outside the window the sky stretched endlessly, calm and distant, while inside the cabin something far more immediate had shifted, something that could not be measured or scheduled or controlled. And Daniel sat there, watching his son breathe, watching him exist without chaos for the first time since takeoff. And he realized slowly, quietly, that this moment was not just about the flight. It was about everything he had misunderstood before it. And that realization settled into him with a weight that did not crush, but changed. And for the first time he did not try to fix it. He simply stayed. The calm did not break, but it shifted into something deeper, something steadier. And Lucas leaned back further into his seat, his body no longer tense, but gently supported by the quiet he had helped create. His fingers still wrapped loosely around the water bottle, as if it anchored him to the moment. And Nia finally adjusted her posture, not standing, not leaving, just shifting slightly, so she could sit more comfortably on the cabin floor, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid disturbing the rhythm that now filled the space. And the soft overhead lights reflected faintly across the curved walls of the plane, no longer harsh, no longer overwhelming, just present. And for a few seconds no one spoke, the silence no longer fragile but shared, understood, almost respected. And Daniel watched his son closely, noticing details he had overlooked before, the way Lucas's shoulders rose evenly now, the way his gaze no longer darted but settled, the way his breathing matched something outside himself instead of fighting against it. And that realization pressed against Daniel's chest, not painful, but heavy with meaning, because it showed him a version of his son he had not seen in a long time, one that did not need to be managed or corrected, just understood. And he leaned forward again, slower this time, careful not to disrupt the moment. "Lucas," he said softly, and this time Lucas responded, not with words, but by turning his head slightly, enough to acknowledge him, enough to show he was present. And that small response felt larger than anything Daniel had experienced that day. And he swallowed, his voice lowering even further. "You are okay," he added, not as an instruction, not as a command, but as reassurance. And Lucas blinked once, then again, as if processing the words, and his grip on the bottle loosened just a bit more. And Nia observed quietly, her eyes moving between them, recognizing the shift without interrupting it, because this moment belonged to them now, not to her. And a flight attendant stepped closer again, this time with a softer expression, leaning slightly toward Daniel. "We can keep the cabin lights dim if that helps," she offered gently, and Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Yes, please." And within moments the lights softened further, the brightness lowering just enough to make the space feel calmer, warmer, and Lucas's breathing steadied even more in response, the environment finally aligning with what he needed instead of working against him. And a man seated nearby adjusted his seat slowly, careful not to create unnecessary noise, while another passenger lowered their window shade halfway, reducing the glare that had once filled the cabin. And without being told, without any formal instruction, the people around them adapted, each small action contributing to the quiet stability that had replaced the earlier chaos. And Daniel noticed that too, the way strangers had shifted. From irritation to awareness, from frustration to something closer to empathy. And it struck him how quickly everything had changed, not because of authority or demand, but because one person had chosen to respond differently. And he looked at Nia again, studying her not as someone out of place, but as someone who understood something he did not. and after a moment he spoke again, his tone respectful now, almost careful. "How did you know?" he asked, and Nia paused briefly before answering her, gaze softening slightly. "Because I have seen it before," she said, and though she did not elaborate, the weight behind her words was clear, and Daniel nodded slowly, not pressing further, sensing that the answer carried more than he needed to hear right now. And Lucas shifted once more, this time leaning his head gently against the seat, his eyes beginning to close, not from exhaustion alone, but from a sense of safety that had not been there before, and the cabin remained quiet, steady, held together by something invisible but undeniable. And Daniel sat back once more, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer dominating the space, but simply existing within it, watching, learning, and for the first time since the flight began, he did not try to control what came next, he simply stayed with it. The rhythm held long enough for the entire cabin to settle into it. Not just Lucas, not just Nia, but everyone, as if the plane itself had adjusted to a quieter frequency, and Lucas's head rested fully against the seat now, his eyes drifting closed in slow intervals, opening briefly, then closing again, the tension that once lived in his small frame replaced by a softness that had not been there before. And Nia watched carefully, not assuming it was over, not rushing the moment, her breathing still steady, still present, like a quiet guide that did not demand attention but remained available. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does he always get this tired after?" He paused, searching for the right word. "After this happens?" And Nia nodded gently, her gaze still on Lucas. "It takes a lot out of him," she said. "It is not just noise. It is everything at once." And Daniel absorbed that, his eyes moving across his son's face, noticing the small details he had missed before, the slight crease in his brow even at rest, the way his fingers still moved faintly, as if holding onto the last threads of sensation, and he leaned back again, quieter now, more aware, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence filled only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional soft movement of a passenger adjusting in their seat. And then Lucas shifted, just slightly, his hand lifting from the armrest and moving hesitantly through the air, not reaching for his father, not pulling away, just searching, and Nia noticed immediately, her voice soft, steady. "You can rest," she said gently. "I am right here." And Lucas's hand paused midair before lowering again, settling against his lap, his breathing evening out further, deeper now, and within moments his eyes closed fully, not in escape, not in overwhelm, but in rest, real rest, the kind that comes when the body no longer feels like it has to fight. And Daniel watched it happen, his expression shifting again, something in his chest loosening in a way he could not quite explain, and he spoke again, quieter than before. "He has not slept like that in weeks," and the admission felt heavier than he expected, like something he had been carrying without realizing it. And Nia nodded slightly, acknowledging it without surprise. "Sometimes they just need to feel safe. Enough to let go," she replied, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, this time not to Nia, but to the space around him, to the cabin that had once felt hostile, impatient, and now felt different, calmer, more human. And he noticed the way passengers avoided loud movements, the way conversation stayed low, the way even the smallest sounds seemed to respect the quiet that had been created, and it struck him how none of this had been forced, none of it commanded. It had simply happened, and that realization lingered, unsettling but also clarifying. And after a moment he leaned forward again, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "Nia," he said, and when she looked up this time, fully, meeting his eyes, he continued, "I would not have known what to do." And the words were simple, but they carried something deeper than gratitude, something closer to admission. And Nia held his gaze for a brief second before offering a small, understanding nod, not making it bigger than it needed to be. "You stayed," she said quietly. "That matters more than you think." And Daniel absorbed that too, the idea settling into him slowly, reshaping something fundamental. And he glanced at Lucas again, still sleeping, still calm. And for the first time he did not feel the urge to prepare for the next problem, the next solution, the next strategy. Instead, he just sat there, present in the moment, allowing it to exist without trying to change it. and the plane continued forward through the sky, steady, quiet, carrying not just passengers, but a shift that none of them had expected when they first boarded. Time moved differently after that, slower, softer, as if the plane had slipped into a pocket where urgency no longer applied, and Lucas remained asleep, his head tilted slightly to the side, his breathing deep and even, each inhale steady, each exhale quiet, and Nia stayed where she was, not because she had to, but because leaving too soon felt like breaking something that had just been rebuilt, and her eyes rested on him with a calm that came from familiarity, not surprise, as if she had seen this exact moment before in another place, another time, and knew how easily it could shift if rushed, and Daniel watched both of them. His posture relaxed now, but his mind still catching up, still trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly without force, without instruction, without the systems he trusted, and he leaned back into his seat, letting the silence settle fully this time, not resisting it, not filling it, just allowing it to exist, and around them the cabin had transformed in small but meaningful ways, a passenger gently adjusting their bag without letting it drop, another slowly turning a page of a magazine with careful hands. Even the flight attendants moved with a kind of quiet awareness, their steps lighter, their voices lowered, as if the entire space had learned something together, and the steady hum of the engines now felt like a constant reassurance rather than a background noise, a reminder that everything was moving forward even in stillness. And after several minutes Daniel spoke again, his voice barely above the ambient sound. "Does he remember these moments?" he asked, not looking directly at Nia this time, but keeping his gaze on Lucas. And Nia considered the question briefly before answering. "Sometimes," she said, "not always in words, but in how he feels afterward." And Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, his eyes softening as he looked at his son, trying to imagine what that meant, trying to understand a language he had not learned yet, and he shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to create noise, his movements now guided by something other than habit, something closer to awareness, and after a pause he added, "I thought helping meant fixing it fast." And the admission came out quieter than he expected, almost as if he was saying it to himself more than to her, and Nia responded gently, her tone steady. "Sometimes helping is just staying long enough." And the words settled into the space between them, simple but heavy with meaning, and Daniel did not respond right away. He just sat with it, letting it sink in, letting it reshape something inside him that had always been driven by urgency and results. And Lucas stirred slightly, not waking, just shifting deeper into his rest, his hand relaxing further as the empty bottle tilted gently against the armrest, and Daniel instinctively reached out, not to correct, not to adjust, but just to make sure it did not fall, his movement slow and careful, and when his hand brushed lightly against Lucas's sleeve, he paused, waiting, watching, but Lucas did not react with tension, he did not pull away, he simply continued to rest, and that small moment, that absence of reaction, felt larger than anything that had come before it, and Daniel withdrew his hand slowly, a quiet understanding forming in the space where control used to be, and he leaned back once more, his gaze drifting toward Nia, and this time there was no question in it, no uncertainty, just recognition, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between them carried a different meaning now, one built on shared understanding rather than confusion, and outside the window the sky stretched endlessly, pale and calm, while inside the cabin something just as vast had shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to change what came next, even if none of them could fully see it yet. The stillness stretched long enough to feel real, not temporary, not fragile, but something that had settled into the cabin like a quiet agreement, and Lucas remained asleep, his breathing deep and even, the kind of rest that did not look forced or interrupted, but natural, as if his body had finally found a place where it did not have to stay on guard, and Nia watched for a few more moments before slowly, carefully, shifting her position again, not rising yet, just easing the weight from one knee to the other, her movements controlled and quiet, and Daniel noticed immediately, his attention sharp in a different way now, not reactive, but aware, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Is it okay if he sleeps like that?" he asked, not because he doubted it, but because he needed to understand the boundaries of this calm, needed to know if it would hold, and Nia nodded gently, her gaze still on Lucas. Sleep helps him reset, she said softly. It lets his mind slow down. And Daniel absorbed that, his eyes returning to his son, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, as if committing it to memory, as if afraid it might change if he looked away. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the constant hum of the engines and the faint rustle of fabric as passengers adjusted carefully in their seats. And then Daniel shifted again, his hands resting loosely now instead of clenched. And he spoke, more slowly this time. I have spent years trying to stay ahead of this, he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. Schedules, specialists, routines, everything planned down to the minute. And he paused, glancing at Nia briefly before looking back at Lucas. And none of it worked like this, and the admission hung in the air, not defensive, not frustrated, just honest. And Nia listened without interrupting, her expression calm, understanding, and after a moment she responded, her tone steady. You were trying to protect him, she said. That is not wrong. And Daniel let out a small breath, the tension in his shoulders easing further. Then why does it feel like I missed something so obvious? He asked quietly. And Nia tilted her head slightly, considering her words before answering. Because what he needs does not always look obvious, she said. It is not about stopping what you see. It is about understanding what he feels. And Daniel nodded slowly, the words settling deeper than he expected, and he leaned back again, his gaze drifting for a moment across the cabin, noticing how different everything felt now, how the same space that had once been filled with frustration and impatience now held something quieter, something more aware, and he realized that the change had not come from control, it had come from connection, something he had not prioritized in the same way. And that realization stayed with him as he looked back at Lucas, still resting, still calm. And after a moment he spoke again, softer than before. When he wakes up, he said, will it come back? And Nia did not answer immediately. She watched Lucas for another breath, another steady rise and fall, before replying. It might, she said honestly, but now he knows he can come back from it. And Daniel absorbed that, the idea settling into him slowly, reshaping something fundamental, and he nodded once, not because he fully understood yet, but because he felt the truth in it. And the cabin remained quiet, steady, as the plane continued forward through the sky, carrying with it a moment that had already changed more than anyone on board could fully see. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead, a gentle tone that usually signaled routine, but this time it carried a different weight, a quiet reminder that the flight was continuing. That time had not stopped even though everything inside the cabin felt altered, and Daniel glanced up briefly before returning his gaze to Lucas, who stirred slightly in his seat, not with tension, but with the natural shift of someone moving between deeper and lighter sleep, and his fingers twitched once against the armrest before settling again. And Nia noticed the change immediately, her posture straightening just a fraction, her attention sharpening without becoming intrusive, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. He might wake soon, she said gently, and Daniel nodded, his expression tightening for just a second, not with fear, but with anticipation, as if he were preparing for something he did not fully understand. And he leaned closer, lowering his voice instinctively. What should I do? He asked, the question simple but carrying a weight it had not carried before, because this time he was not asking for control, he was asking for guidance. And Nia did not rush her answer. She watched Lucas's breathing for another moment before responding. Do not rush him, she said softly. Let him come back at his own pace. And Daniel absorbed that, nodding slowly, his hands resting still as if he were holding himself back from instinct. And the cabin remained quiet, the passengers around them still moving carefully, still aware, as if they too were waiting to see what would happen next. And Lucas shifted again, his head tilting slightly before his eyes began to open, slowly, not wide, not startled, just a gradual return to awareness. And for a brief moment his gaze seemed unfocused, as if he were still halfway between two places, and then his eyes settled, first on the seat in front of him, then slowly, cautiously, toward Nia, and he blinked once, then again, his breathing steady but slightly quicker now, not panicked, just adjusting. and Nia did not move closer. She stayed exactly where she was, her presence unchanged, her breathing still slow and even, offering the same rhythm he had followed before. And Lucas watched her for a second longer before his lips parted slightly, his voice soft, almost uncertain. "It stopped," he said. The words simple but clear, and Daniel felt something in his chest shift at the sound, his breath catching just slightly, because this time there was no strain in Lucas's voice, no confusion, just awareness. And Nia gave a small nod, her expression calm. "You helped it stop," she replied, reinforcing the moment without overwhelming it. And Lucas blinked again, processing that, his gaze lowering briefly to his hands before lifting again. And this time he looked toward his father, not with distress, not with avoidance, but with a quiet openness that had not been there earlier. And Daniel held that look carefully, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Hey," he said, not adding anything more, not filling the space, just meeting him where he was. And Lucas did not pull away. He simply watched, and for a few seconds that was enough, and Nia observed the exchange quietly, recognizing the importance of what was happening, the space being rebuilt between them. And she shifted slightly, just enough to ease the tension in her legs, but still careful not to break the flow of the moment. And outside the window the sky stretched endlessly, unchanged, while inside the cabin something far more delicate was taking shape, something that required no force, no urgency, just presence. And Daniel remained still, resisting every instinct to guide or correct, allowing Lucas to move through the moment on his own terms. And in that stillness, something new began to form, not loud, not obvious, but real enough to change what came next. Lucas did not look away this time, and that alone changed something in the air between them, subtle but undeniable, like a door that had been closed for too long finally opening just enough to let light through. And Daniel stayed still, resisting the instinct to move closer, to fill the space with words or reassurance, because for the first time he understood that too much could be just as overwhelming as too little. And Lucas blinked slowly, his gaze steady but soft, and then he shifted, slightly in his seat, his hand moving again, not searching now, but reaching with intention. And it hovered for a moment before resting lightly on the edge of the armrest closest to his father, not touching him, but close enough to matter. And Daniel noticed immediately, his breath catching for a brief second before he let it out. Slowly, careful not to react too quickly, careful not to break the fragile bridge that was forming. And he adjusted his hand just slightly, placing it near Lucas's without closing the distance, offering presence without pressure. And for a moment that was all there was. Two hands resting inches apart, the quiet hum of the plane surrounding them. And then Lucas moved just a little closer, enough for the back of his fingers to brush against Daniel's hand. And he did not pull away. He did not tense. He simply stayed. And Daniel felt the contact like something far larger than it should have been. A simple touch carrying the weight of weeks, maybe months, of distance. And he kept his hand still, not closing around it, not reacting, just allowing it to exist. And Nia watched from the floor, her expression unchanged but her attention sharp, recognizing the moment for what it was, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply important. And she remained silent, because this part did not belong to her anymore. And Lucas shifted again, his voice soft but clearer now. "It is quieter when you do not rush," he said, the words slow, deliberate, as if he were discovering them as he spoke. And Daniel felt something inside him settle at that. Something that had been tight for far too long, and he nodded slightly, his voice low. "I hear you," he replied, not promising change, not over-explaining, just acknowledging. And Lucas's fingers relaxed a little more against his, the tension that had once filled every movement now replaced by something steadier, something calmer. And the cabin remained quiet around them, not out of obligation, but out of respect, as if everyone present understood that this moment was not something to interrupt. And a flight attendant paused a few rows away, watching briefly before moving on without speaking, her steps light, her presence careful. And Daniel glanced once toward Nia, his eyes holding a different kind of expression now, something deeper than gratitude, something closer to recognition. And he spoke quietly. "You changed everything in here." And Nia shook her head gently, her voice soft. "No," she said. "He did." And she tilted her head slightly toward Lucas, he just needed space to find it. And Daniel followed her gaze, looking at his son again, really seeing him, not as a problem to manage, not as a situation to control, but as a person navigating something complex and overwhelming. And that shift in perspective settled into him fully now, no longer uncomfortable, but necessary. And Lucas leaned back into his seat once more, his breathing steady, his body relaxed, his hand still resting lightly against his father's, and the quiet that filled the cabin was no longer something fragile or temporary. It was something real, something earned. And as the plane continued forward through the sky, carrying them all toward a destination still miles away, it also carried something else, something unseen but lasting, a change that had already begun to reshape what would happen long after they landed. The connection did not break after that. It deepened, quietly, almost invisibly, like something settling into place after being misaligned for too long. And Lucas kept his hand where it was, light against his father's, not gripping, not needing to, just resting in a way that felt natural. And Daniel did not move either, his hand steady, his posture relaxed in a way that would have been impossible an hour ago. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because words would have added too much, would have complicated something that had finally become simple. And Nia watched from where she sat, her presence still calm, still grounded, but now more distant, not because she was leaving, but because she understood that the space between them no longer needed her to hold it together. And that realization showed in the way she slowly shifted her weight again, preparing, not to interrupt, but to step back when the moment allowed it. And Lucas blinked slowly, his gaze moving between his father and the space in front of him. And then he spoke again, his voice steady, clearer than before. "It is not loud anymore," he said. And Daniel nodded, his voice soft. "No, it is not." And Lucas took a small breath, deeper this time, as if testing the calm. And when nothing changed, when the noise did not return, his shoulders lowered just a fraction more, the last visible tension easing from his frame. And Daniel noticed that too, every small shift, every quiet signal. And instead of reacting, instead of trying to guide it, he simply stayed present, letting Lucas lead the moment in his own way. And after a few seconds Daniel spoke again, carefully. "When it feels like that again," he said, choosing each word slowly, "we can do this together." And Lucas looked at him, really looked, and for a brief moment there was something new in his expression, not just calm, not just relief, but recognition, as if he understood that this was not just about the moment, but about what came after it. And he nodded once, small but certain, and that simple movement carried more meaning than any long explanation could have. And Nia saw it too, the shift from reaction to understanding, from chaos to connection, and she allowed herself a small breath, the kind that comes when something important has settled fully. And then she moved, slowly, carefully, placing one hand on the seat beside her to steady herself as she rose from the floor, her movements quiet enough that they did not disrupt the calm. And Daniel noticed immediately, his attention shifting back to her. And for a second it looked like he might say something quickly, something urgent, but he stopped himself, remembering, adjusting, and instead he waited until she was fully standing before speaking, his voice low, sincere. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried everything he had not been able to express before. And Nia met his gaze, her expression soft, not surprised, not expecting more. "You are welcome," she replied, and then after a small pause she added, "He did the hard part." And Daniel nodded slowly, accepting that, understanding it now in a way he had not earlier. And Lucas looked up at her as well, his eyes steady. And for a brief moment it seemed like he might say something more, but instead he just held her gaze. And that was enough, because everything that needed to be understood had already been felt. And Nia gave a small nod in return, a quiet acknowledgement, before stepping back toward her seat, not rushing, not drawing attention, just moving as if she had always belonged to the background of the cabin. And as she settled back into her place, the plane continued forward, steady, unchanged in its path. But inside, something had shifted completely, something that would not return to what it had been before, because this time, they all knew what quiet could feel like when someone chose to stay. The plane began its gradual descent without announcement, the shift so subtle it could only be felt in the slight change of pressure, the soft adjustment in the hum of the engines, and outside the window the sky deepened into a quieter shade of blue, the horizon stretching wide and calm, and inside the cabin nothing broke, nothing rushed, the quiet held, not because it had to, but because it had become natural, and Lucas sat upright now, fully awake, his posture relaxed in a way that had not been there when they boarded, his hand still resting near his father's, not gripping, not searching, just present, and Daniel remained beside him, no longer watching with urgency, no longer calculating what came next, just staying in the moment as it was. And for a while neither of them spoke, because they did not need to, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of something steady, something understood, and a flight attendant passed by quietly, offering a small, knowing smile before moving on, her steps light, her presence careful, and the rest of the passengers returned slowly to their own worlds, conversations resuming in low tones, pages turning, headphones sliding back on. But the energy had changed, softer now, more aware, as if something unseen had left its mark, and Daniel finally leaned back into his seat, his gaze drifting briefly toward the back of the cabin, toward where Nia now sat again, blending into the background, her hoodie sleeves pulled slightly over her hands, her posture relaxed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and for a moment he considered standing, walking back, saying more, offering something tangible, something measurable, but he stopped himself, recognizing that what she had given could not be measured that way, and instead he simply looked, committing the moment to memory, before turning back to Lucas, and Lucas followed his gaze briefly, his eyes landing on Nia for just a second, and then returning forward, not with confusion, not with distance, but with quiet understanding, and Daniel spoke then, his voice low, steady. "We are going to remember this." And Lucas nodded once, small but certain, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest in a calm, steady rhythm, matching the hum of the engines, and the plane continued its descent, smooth and controlled, the ground slowly coming into view through the window, lights appearing in neat patterns far below, and as the wheels prepared to meet the runway, the cabin remained calm, the earlier chaos now feeling distant, almost unreal. And when the landing gear lowered with a soft mechanical shift, Lucas did not tense. He did not react with overwhelm. He simply adjusted his posture slightly, his breathing steady, his focus grounded, and Daniel noticed immediately, his chest easing, in a way that felt new, not because everything was solved, but because something had changed, something real. And when the plane touched down, the moment passed smoothly, the slight vibration contained, controlled, and the cabin filled with the usual sounds of arrival, seatbelts unfastening, overhead bins opening, voices rising just a little, but even then, the quiet understanding remained, and Daniel stayed seated for a moment longer, allowing others to move ahead, not out of hesitation, but because there was no urgency left in him, and Lucas sat beside him, calm, present, waiting without restlessness, and as they finally stood, stepping into the aisle, Daniel placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder, not to guide, not to control, just to connect, and Lucas did not pull away. He simply walked with him, steady, and as they moved toward the exit, Daniel glanced back one last time. But Nia was already blending into the flow of passengers, just another traveler among many, her presence quiet, her impact lasting, and the moment settled into something final, something simple. And as they stepped out into the open air beyond the plane, the world felt the same, but Daniel knew it was not. Because he carried something different now, something he had not understood before, and it stayed with him in the silence between steps, in the steady rhythm of breath, in the space where control used to live, and as the door closed behind them, and the plane prepared for its next flight, the only thing left was the quiet truth that had unfolded without force, without power, without demand. That sometimes the most important change does not come from being in charge, but from choosing to stay long enough to understand.